All right, thanks so much, Michael. Thank you all for coming out today. Pleasure to be here. Get myself reset here. All right. So I am going to give a presentation that will go for, I think, about 45 minutes. Hopefully we'll have time for some questions and answers after that. I'm going to speak both extemporaneously and also read some from my script so that I make sure that I get the right information out. So anyway, hopefully we'll have a good conversation after all of that. This lecture will serve a few purposes. It will give an overview of the early 20th century German school of art and design known as the Bauhaus. It will trace ways that a few of its members responded to aspects of the Cold War, and it will prepare the ground for a series of workshops that will be held at the Wende Museum over the next couple months. And in fact, I've already begun with a textile workshop led by Cameron Taylor Brown recently, and also one by Michael Beggs. I've included information and images about specific topics that were taught at the Bauhaus, which may inform the ways that the Wende workshop teachers will approach their material. Over the next days, I'll teach workshops based on color and design, drawing on how those topics were taught at the Bauhaus. In each case, I'll include aspects that expand on what was specifically taught at the historic Bauhaus. The other artists who will teach in the series over the coming weeks have been invited because their practices connect in some way to ideas from the Bauhaus, but we've given them a very open hand in how they choose to teach, so long as it adheres to the broad Bauhaus conceit of learning by doing. Michael used the phrase sort of a playground atmosphere, which I think is exactly right. It's definitely a learning through play. All right, so on the screen, we have two photographs of the historic Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was formed in 1919 by an architect called Walter Gropius. And its initial, and I'll give you more history as we go through, but this building on the left was its initial building in Weimar, Germany. And then in 1926, it moved to the building on the right, which was designed by Gropius in Dessau, Germany. And then in 1933, just for a couple of months, it moved from Dessau to Berlin, and then it was forced to close under pressure from the Nazis. The Bauhaus was formed in response to a number of forces that were larger than itself, of course. The Industrial Revolution was a big one. It had been going on for the previous 150 years or so, and it certainly provided a lot of new goods for people. Household goods were suddenly much cheaper and much more readily available than they had been across Europe for the previous millennia. But it was widely observed that the quality was really low. And so these factories were just churning out garbage, kind of. Also around that time, what became known as the educational turn was underway, which was changing the way that society looked at what education could be. And then finally, the Great Disruption of World War I immediately preceded the founding of the Bauhaus in 1919. It was widely observed that the Industrial Revolution enabled the production of household goods on a previously unimaginable scale, but the quality of these products was terrible. One glaring reason was that the designers of these objects were no longer involved in their creation. An early response to that was the arts and crafts movement, which formed in the mid-19th century in England. Its founder, William Morris, proclaimed that his company, Morris & Company, made goods for the people and by the people. Essentially, Morris hoped to put materials back into the hands of designers. Arts and crafts led to Art Nouveau, which began to look more like luxury goods than items for common use. Though an emphasis remained on the work of artists and craftspeople, objects became more ornate and the materials more expensive. The reality of any of this being for the people became less and less possible. So here we see a few of Morris's early furniture designs. So these would have been produced by craftsmen, designed by craftsmen, based on historic British furniture designs, but he's sort of finding a new economical way for this to happen. And fairly shortly, he moves into wallpaper design, such as this, which is sort of extremely ornamental, right? So the extreme ornamentation of some of Morris's later designs would then become something for subsequent designers to denounce, right? The pendulum has to swing. Also occurring across the 19th century was what became known as the educational turn. For centuries, only the children of very wealthy families would receive formal education. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile of 1762 marked the beginning of a shift in how people thought about education. In it, a fictional boy named Emile learns a number of lessons through guided experience. Essentially, he is learning by doing. In the late 18th century, a Swiss clergyman named Johann Pestalozzi brought the ideas of Emile into practice, forming schools for orphans, a group that previously would never have been candidates for formal education. By the mid-19th century, Friedrich Froebel, who had worked for a period in one of Pestalozzi's schools, established the kindergarten model of education, which took the idea of learning by doing several steps further. It quickly spread through Germany and eventually around the world. By the early 20th century, formal education had become seen as something that a much broader public could, and for the betterment of society should, attain. And then came the great disruption of World War I. Forming in its wake, the Bauhaus can be seen as a reaction to all of it. The war, the Industrial Revolution, new ideas about education, and the perceived crimes of ornament committed by practitioners of Art Nouveau. The terrors wrought by machinery in the war were fresh in everyone's memory. There was a longing for the romantic ideals of a pre-war, pre-modern existence. Add to that the terrible economy of post-World War I Germany and the accompanying material scarcity, and you have all the ingredients for the early years of the Bauhaus. Many of the objects students created were decidedly handmade, such as this material study made by Moses Merkin in Johannes Itten's preliminary course. It is hardly of the aesthetic that we now associate with the Bauhaus, clean lines, no ornament, clear functionality, but it is a wonderful example of what was going on in the school's earliest years. To further underline the need for frugality in this period in German history, there existed an imperial clothing authority, which issued a statement in 1920 saying that there is simply no such thing as an unusable object. Did they mean that a broken saw should be combined with an orphaned lantern glass and other materials in a sculptural experiment? Likely they were focused on more functional instances, though nevertheless, the sentiment applies. From the Bauhaus's inception, it was established that incoming students would first go through a preliminary course. In some ways, this marks a culmination of the 19th century educational turn. For centuries in Europe and elsewhere, art education ascribed to a master-apprentice model, in which you, as a young person, age 7 or 11 or 13 possibly, would have been identified by your parents or the community, and you would have been then placed with a master of goldsmithing or ceramics or weaving or whatever the field, and you had very little choice in that matter. It was just decided by the elders in your community. And you would have apprenticed then for 7 years, and at a certain point you would have become a junior master, and then finally you would become your own master and start taking your own apprentices. And very little freedom of movement within that. And broadly, this was how arts and crafts education existed across centuries prior to the educational turn and to the Bauhaus sort of crystallizing this idea that as young people, as 11-year-olds certainly, but even 18, 19, 20-year-olds, we might not fully be formed and know exactly where our skills lie and our interests lie. From our perspective in the 21st century, it seems perfectly natural that we would go through some sort of basically a liberal arts education or a foundations where you learn a bunch of things and go from there. But that idea had to start somewhere, and the Bauhaus is not the only one, but they are sort of the ones we look to as where that idea really crystallized. Things began to change at the Bauhaus in 1922. Johannes Itten, who had run the preliminary course for the first 3 years of the school's existence, was asked to leave. Now, there's a much longer, juicier story there that I'm not going to fully expound upon here, but briefly, Itten was, I think, a very charismatic teacher. I think he was a very gifted teacher, very good painter, good artist. And across the late teens and early 20s, he had started a practice of religion called Mazdaznan, which was an American take on Zoroastrianism. I promise this is going to be a quick divergence. And in that religion, an adherent would dress only in white and might adopt a very specific diet that included toast and garlic and water and very little else. And because Itten was doing this, and he was this charismatic leading teacher, and I think other things in society, sort of people needed some guidance, a lot of the students at the Bauhaus were starting to follow along with this. And at first this seemed okay, but eventually it became a distraction. And so the school's administration, specifically Gropius, pulled Itten aside and said, look, this is becoming a distraction. And depending on whose history you read, either Itten left out of his own accord to find greener pastures, or he was pushed out one way or the other. In any case, he left in 22. In 1923, the school changed their motto from art and craft, a new unity, to art and industry, a new unity. That turn towards industrialism in the institution's mission came about in part because the Bauhaus was under pressure from their state sponsors to show what the students were doing, which came with intense financial pressure. A curriculum that could engage with the potential growth of industry was understandable. Many students were eager to move beyond what it started to feel to some like a naive approach to material. Further explaining the Bauhaus's rapid evolution from the evidently handmade to something closer to industrial design, in 1922, 3 figures associated with international constructivism arrived in Weimar. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, known as Moholy, who would soon join the Bauhaus faculty, convened with the Dutch painter Theo van Doesburg and the Russian painter L. Lissitzky. Concurrent with exhibitions of Russian art in major German cities, the pro-machine ideology and abstract anti-pictorial imagery these 3 endorsed found fertile ground in the nebulous early Bauhaus, ready for change. In more medium-specific terms, Annie Albers, in her essay, Weaving at the Bauhaus, writing about that very period retrospectively in 1938, so it's 38, she's looking back at 22, said, a shift took place from the free play of forms to a logical building of structures. Concentrating on a purpose had a disciplining effect, now that the range of possibilities had been freely explored. We'll hear more from Annie, who was a wonderful writer, very soon. With the departure of Itten, Gropius invited the Hungarian Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, known as Moholy, to run the preliminary course, where Itten's approach to the preliminary course, that sort of foundations course that all students went through, was very much based on material studies, sort of bringing together various everyday materials. Itten was focused on self-expression, so students would find self-expression through these materials. Contrary to that, different than that, rather, Moholy applied a more of a pseudoscience approach to this. He was essentially an industrial designer. That was not a term that existed yet at that point, but he was really running his class as if these students would eventually engage with industry, which was exactly what the school asked him to do. Keep in mind that shift to arts and industry, a new unity, happened at the exact same time. And so in this example, the student, Gustav Hassenpflug, made this in 1927, and that arrow in the upper left is actually, seems to be a piece of paper that's been sort of wired in there to give us an indication of where our finger is supposed to go. We are meant to run our finger over that bridge of different materials. So it looks as though there are 2 coil springs that are held in some sort of a framework, and then all these different materials are slotted into those. We don't know what those materials are. I could guess that it's probably maybe strips of leather, and then strips of cellophane, and then little pieces of glass, and then paper, and then, I don't know, felt, and a few other materials. Whatever they are, it's a repeatable event. You can keep running your finger over that, and it keeps being the same thing, which is why I say it's pseudoscience, because it's something you can keep testing over and over, but with a subjective response. You don't know, I guess there are quantifiable ways that you could say this, but Hassenpflug's response is this drawing that he's placed across the bottom of it with the same arrows, so we know that our finger's moving through the same place. So for Hassenpflug, that first material feels like a bunch of circles, and then the next material feels like feels like dashes, and then squares, and then differently arranged dashes, and then we get to triangles, and then stippling. So certainly a subjective interpretation of what that is, but we understand the material through that in a very specific way. This touching board made by the great weaver Adi Berger when she was a student in Moholy's preliminary course shows something of how the thinking of material studies transferred to the weaving studio. Before any actual weaving took place, the weavers were thinking about texture and structure, but without the complexity of actual weaving yet needing to be in place. It's also important to know, Berger then had a very successful weaving career for about a decade, but she was Jewish and was murdered at Auschwitz in 1944. Moholy left the Bauhaus in 1928, at which point Joseph Albers, who had arrived at the school in 1920 as a student and began teaching in the preliminary course in 1922, became the lead teacher. Where for Itten, self-expression was the purpose of a lot of the assignments in that preliminary course, and for Itten, there was a sort of pseudoscience thing going on. For Albers, he takes something from both of them and he finds, or he asks his students to find the natural expression of the material itself. So find things that only that material would be able to do. This photograph from around 1930, we see them all experimenting with corrugated cardboard and probably some paperboard and doing various folding things that might show up in some of the workshops that already have happened or will be happening here. But essentially asking what can that material do that no other material could do. Another material also from Albers' preliminary course, wire screen. So every student would have been given, let's say, a 12-inch square of wire screen. And anecdotally, we know that Albers would hand the material out and then say very little, leave the room for a few hours and come back, and they'd have critique. And if you had formed your wire screen into a house or a boat or a whatever, some known object, that was probably not the answer. You might say, no, this is kindergarten stuff. If, on the other hand, like Lis Bossian, the student, I would imagine that Bossian took a pencil or a skewer and stuck it through that wire screen many times. And because of the memory of the iron, it held that shape. And then I would imagine that she took some scissors and very cleverly clipped around the top so that some of that structure sticks out the top of it. Only that material is going to behave that way. If you had clay or paper or some other thing and did the same exact motion, you would have some sort of a result, but it wouldn't be this. This shows a very specific expression of this material. The Bauhaus had at its heart what some considered to be a utopian goal. It would be a Gesamtkunstwerk, or total artwork, a spirit of creativity that would encapsulate the entire school. Inspired to some degree by a longing for a past ideal, it was never quite achieved. Writing years later, again, Annie Albers expressed it thusly: "Wholeness is not a utopian dream. It is something that we once possessed and now seem largely to have lost, or to say it less pessimistically, seem to have lost were it not for our inner sense of direction, which still reminds us that something is wrong here because we know of something that is right." It's an awful lot she's packed into that. And so she's looking back, she writes this in 1959, at which point she's already in the US and is looking back across many, many decades, but thinking about what was at the Bauhaus, what changed in the decades after the Bauhaus, and her understanding of what that was, there's sort of a bittersweetness to this, that she knows that there was a beautiful thing because it's not here now, and she also knows that the Bauhaus wasn't it. It was sort of circling it, but it wasn't quite it. All right, the slide is out of order. I'm going to try to just play it cool here. The building in Weimar that the Bauhaus occupied. No, everything's fine. This is the slide that's meant to be. It's all here. The building in Weimar that the Bauhaus occupied had been designed as an art school by Henry van de Velde and comprised several purpose-built workshops devoted to a range of disciplines. The Bauhaus made the spaces fit into Gropius's conception of a school as Gesamtkunstwerk. As an architect, he saw that each workshop could contribute to the practice of architecture, that the entire school would unify art, craft, and design. Over the course of the 14 years that the school existed, there were workshop spaces dedicated to cabinetry, ceramics, metal, photography, printmaking, sculpture, stained glass, stage design, typography, wall painting, and weaving. So that starts to feel a bit utopian, right? And I think that Gropius might have, in his best moments really been a true utopian. Of course, none of these dreams exactly played out, but nevertheless, all these ideas were present. So I'm going to take us through just a few slides that show us some of the things that were happening there. I'm not going to thoroughly dig into all of the workshops because we don't have nearly enough time for all of that. But I think also this will give us some sense of the things that could be going on in some of the workshops that will be led here at Wende over the coming weeks and months. That is absolutely not to say that you were going to make a coffee and tea service on this level. I'm not sure that I've seen that workshop on the list. But in that, right, so in that first slide that I thought was misplaced, the metal workshop, and this is in the Weimar school. I've tried to note which school that we're in so you can start to see the inside of the architecture. This is that early school, the first one in Weimar. Marianne Brandt was one of the few female artists who was not placed in the weaving workshop. So there's a longer story there, but the Bauhaus was an early example of a school that had both female and male students. And the school's response was to create a women's department, and that women's department almost immediately became the weaving department. And most women were then placed in that weaving department, Marianne Brandt being a wonderful exception to that, made lots of incredible metal work. The cabinetry workshop, seen here on the left in its Weimar iteration, on the right in the Dessau iteration. Joseph Albers worked in the cabinetry workshop from 1925 through 29 and produced objects like this, his stacking tables. The glass workshop, seen here in Weimar in 1923, Gropius. Albers arrived at the Bauhaus in 1920 as a student, and he had, prior to being at the Bauhaus, done a little bit of glass work he designed a window for the church in his hometown. And so therefore was attracted to the glass workshop, found his way into that. Probably two of the things leaning against the window are of his design. One of them would have been similar to this from 1921, shard painting. So this is 21. There's very little money anywhere in Germany. Remember, there's that edict from the Imperial Clothing Authority that there's no such thing as a material that has no use, or whatever the phrase was. So Albers would be going to the town dump with a bag and a hammer, and he'd be breaking up bottles and stitching them together and finding ways to use them as the material. So if we look at this, the circles are in fact the bottoms of bottles, and a pre-existing iron grid that he probably also found in that same dump and then cut in clever ways. He's then attached glass samples and broken bottles onto that using wire and grout and any number of other things that can stick the thing together, and then wrap the whole thing in tin. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge, an interesting thing. It is a stained glass window in a sense, but there's certainly no image of any religious thing or anything narrative at all. It is purely abstract. It is purely color and glass and coming together in this abstract form, which is a study of the material as an expression of itself. There was a theater. So the chairs here, designed by Marcel Breuer, the lightwork designed by Rietveld. And there was an active theatrical program going on. Oskar Schlemmer was teaching theater and dance. He designed the triadic ballet. So applying the same learning by doing ideas to ballet and sort of bringing everything down to this very essential non-ornamental level, and then applying that to dance. I believe there will be some level of movement going on in at least one of the workshops. We already did it. Anyone participate? How was it?
It was unusual. We had to really slow down. And
Yeah.
had a lot of kind of rules and working within parameters, freedom within some parameters.
Freedom within parameters. That's a great way to look at it. I like that. The typography workshop, where they were often charged with promoting various events, promoting the school itself. They invented their own typefaces, and most of those were emphatically non-ornamental. And that was in part because they were reacting against previous German typefaces that were extraordinarily ornamental, this sort of being an extreme version of this from 1843. Even though we know that's an alphabet, it's almost impossible to pick out letters, at least to my eye. And so the pendulum swings from one end to the other. Joseph Albers designs a typeface around 1926, and there's zero ornament whatsoever in this. There's no serifs. Here it is in sketch form. We can see a little bit further into it. So this would have been designed specifically for lettering on the outside of buildings. So not long sentences. You can imagine this would be quite difficult to read long sentences in, but the name on the side of a building probably does work pretty well. The weaving workshop, which I already noted, was heavily female, but not exclusively. Here is the group of students who were in the weaving workshop around 1927. Something I hadn't previously noted, that every workshop had both a master of form and a master of design. The master of form was someone who knew the techniques of the materials and the tools that were associated with that workshop. And then the master of design would be the one who would make more aesthetic decisions about what that workshop was actually producing. And in that, the school was trying to support itself by making things that industry could actually use. There did need to be some level of a sort of overarching aesthetic output. In each case, the master of design was a painter. So here we are in the weaving workshop. The master of form is, I have a cursor here. Yeah, that's Günther Stölzl there. And then who was the master of form. She was the actual technically proficient weaver. And then Georg Mucke on the far left is the master of design. Mucke hadn't a clue how to weave, I don't think. But nevertheless, he was there telling them how to do it. One of Annie Albers's designs from that period, from 1925. And then the actual object that was produced from that. So in this case, we very rarely know exactly what Annie was up to before she was on the loom. She's not someone who kept her weaving drafts, but from her student days, we have some of the early designs. And so it's nice to see the actual comparison that some things did change from the earliest conception to its realization. Albers was someone who always wanted to show her materials and her process, was never hiding or doing any sort of visual trickery. And I don't use this next example in any sort of pejorative trickery sense, but Günther Stölzl was far more interested in sort of the most dramatic things that could be done on the loom. So this tapestry from just a couple of years later, we see all these amazing moves, which are certainly possible within weaving, but it becomes much more difficult for a non-weaver to look at this and then understand what's actually going on. This is a very difficult weaving to have produced. So these are both sort of the fine art end of weaving, but the weaving workshop was also very much making functional fabrics. In 1928, Gropius, who had founded the school and then was its leader for many years, left the school. And the new director was another architect named Hannes Meyer. Now, Meyer had a commission that year with his partner Han Witwer to create the trade union school in Bernau, Germany, which is a town a little bit north of Berlin. And that school has in it an auditorium. And when it was early in its construction, they realized it was very echoey. And so Hannes Meyer approached Annie Albers, who was still a student at that time, and asked her to design a fabric that could dampen the echoes in that room. So Albers designed essentially a two-sided fabric, which did more than what Meyer had asked her to do. He simply wanted the sound to be dampened. She created this two-sided fabric, one side being a cotton chenille, that would be sort of a classic way to dampen sound, a very fuzzy fabric that would absorb echoes. But then on the other side of the fabric that would actually face into the room, she wove cellophane threads. So very, very thin cellophane, which in mass then start to look silvery. And they then reflect light into that space. So this very economical, very elegant solution produced both a dampening effect and a brightening effect. And for that effort, she was given her Bauhaus diploma. So I found this slide. I'll give Andrea Riegel credit for it because it captured it so well. Thought I'd just use it straight as it is. As I'd said, the Bauhaus moved twice first from Weimar to Dessau and then from Dessau to Berlin. There were 3 directors, Gropius at the beginning, and then Meyer, and then at the end, Mies van der Rohe, just known as Mies. And across all those periods, there are different sort of themes. The very early years were very much about expressionism and sort of the spiritualism that were encapsulated by Itten. And then we move into functionalism of art and industry, that new unity. When Meyer comes along, Meyer is a communist, openly communist, and so everything becomes about the collective vision of how things can better serve the collective whole, people's needs over luxury. And then at a certain point, Meyer is asked to leave because of his open communist agenda, and Mies comes in, and Mies is sort of the academic architect and sort of pushes the school in that direction. As director, Hannes Meyer continued the program that Gropius had begun, but with much more emphasis on function, less on aesthetics. In this period, a small but vocal group of leftist students protested Albers' preliminary course, saying that it was too formal and would lead only to aestheticized objects for bourgeois consumption. Albers himself saw no such dichotomy between function and form, but nevertheless complained to his friends that he felt ostracized. Meyer was forced out of the Bauhaus in 1930 because of his openly communist agenda, which ran afoul of a German government that was veering sharply to the right. He and several students who also had communist sympathies emigrated to Moscow. The so-called Red Bauhaus Brigade sought to apply Bauhaus principles of functional design to a socialist framework. However, as nationalism rose under Stalin in the early 1930s, the Red Bauhauslers began to fall out of favor. Meyer left the Soviet Union in 1936, settling in Mexico in 1939, where he continued to work in architecture and in planning. Another Bauhaus architect and furniture designer, Mart Stamm, stayed in Germany during the war, settling in East Berlin in its aftermath. In 1950, he was made director of the Berlin Weissensee Academy, where he tried to revive Bauhaus pedagogy in the East German context. The GDR required that the curriculum focus on functionalism over all else, which Stamm attempted to balance with the modernist design he had absorbed at the Bauhaus. For a short while, this seemed possible, but in 1951, a mandate arrived that everything at the school must reflect Stalinist aesthetics. What was called modernism in the West was dubbed formalism in the East. Formalism, in this sense, was the manipulation of form as an end in itself, rather than a means with which to convey socialist ideology. Therefore, anything bearing what could be construed as a Bauhaus aesthetic was deemed formalist and Western and was not welcome in East Germany during the Cold War. Stamm was dismissed from his post in 1952, after which he moved to West Germany. Most Bauhaus masters settled in the West. Gropius and Breuer both ended up at Harvard. Gropius was the chair of the School of Architecture at Harvard for many years, for decades. Mies ended up in Chicago, where he designed these just massive skyscrapers that still sort of define what we think of as mid-century skyscraper architecture. And the Alberses ended up at Black Mountain College. There's a sort of a long, involved story of how the Alberses ended up there, but I'll try to be quick about it. Philip Johnson, the American architect who had designed the Glass House, or would eventually design the Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut, amongst many other buildings, had visited the Bauhaus in 1927, and then again a couple of years later, befriended Annie Albers, and probably Joseph as well, but certainly we know he befriended Annie. And when he learned that the Bauhaus was closing in 1933, he was already in the room, in the mix of creating this new school in North Carolina called Black Mountain College. Black Mountain was a liberal arts college. It was a progressive liberal arts college outside Asheville, North Carolina, formed again with this learning by doing ethic and aesthetic by a group of professors who had left Rollins College for another longer story that I'll have to leave off here. And they'd formed this new school. Johnson has his irons in that fire also, and knows that the Bauhaus is closing and thinks, wouldn't it be great to have a couple of Bauhaus teachers come and be injected into this new learning by doing experiment in North Carolina? And so he invites them over. The Alberses arrive Thanksgiving 1933 and spend the next 16 years there. So this is the nadir of the Great Depression. There's no money. this group of professors who left Rollins College intentionally did not form a board of trustees at Black Mountain because they had just had a bad experience with trustees pushing them out of Rollins. And so they said, well, we won't have that problem again. But that also meant they never had the money again, because a board of trustees, amongst many other things, might provide some funds for a school or an institution to do the things it needs to do. So this school never had money. It was Great Depression, no trustees. The Alberses arrive, and Annie Albers later described it as a creative vacuum. She meant that in the best terms, that it was someplace where they could make everything new. They had no choice because the school had no money. So here they are. The school partly supported itself through farming. So there's some sort of pastoral scene going on. They're not sure exactly what the animal behind them is, but in any case, it was a pastoral situation. They were making themselves as they wanted to be. Albers's lessons from the Bauhaus had focused heavily on material studies, on these experiments where students would find the natural expression of their material. That modified slightly when they came to Black Mountain College, but continued. It made a lot of sense because it could be done with almost any materials. You didn't need to spend money on marble or fancy paints or gold leaf or whatever it is. And so what had been sort of an industrial design leaning assignment at the Bauhaus becomes something more poetic at Black Mountain College, which is a liberal arts college. The students are not expecting to go and work in factories or design for industry. Some of them ended up doing things like that, but most of them went on to be historians or geographers or architects or whatever else they did. So Jane Slater was a student in the 1940s, known as Slats, and in Albers's class, she made this material study. Albers started calling them the matière at Black Mountain College because he thought that the French word matière had more of a visual connotation than the English word material. So this matière of eggshells and doily really says something interesting about these materials. There's no great trickery or great craft being exhibited here. Simply the eggs have been broken and probably eaten, and then the eggshells washed out, and then Slats cut the doily, this paper doily, and lined some of, here, I'll show a detail of that. No detail? No detail, sorry. Lined some of those eggshells with the doily. And what we understand about those two materials, because we've all touched both of these materials, is informed by them being juxtaposed in this way. The crispiness of the doily is informing the jaggedness and smoothness of the eggshell, and vice versa. They're complicating one another. We understand something more about the material simply through this composition. Albers continued paper folding because it remained this sort of quintessential material that can do incredible things, but also has extreme limitations. And as you invest yourself into it, you start to really feel what those things are. The many people with Bauhaus connections who filtered through Black Mountain College included the Swiss theater director Zanti Szewinski, who taught there in the 1930s. In 1936, he staged Spectodrama, an interdisciplinary theater piece that he had first developed at the Bauhaus. It blended optics, sound, and movement with exaggerated costumes, some of which were directly inspired by paper folding techniques Szewinski would have known from Albers's classes. Having left the Bauhaus in 1928, Moholy spent a few years in London before emigrating to Chicago, where in 1937 he founded the new Bauhaus, which was quickly absorbed into the Illinois Institute of Design. Around the same time, his Bauhaus students' material studies were featured prominently in a major 1938 MoMA Bauhaus exhibition. Having positioned itself as the arbiter of modern aesthetics in the United States, MoMA's exhibition signaled loudly that the Bauhaus design was modern design. Artists, designers, and schools across the US and beyond took note, and what had already taken root in places like Black Mountain College became more and more prominent. Fellow Hungarian Gegor Kepes came to Chicago to study with and later teach alongside Moholy. These were the war years, and the Institute of Design, like many institutions, felt pressure to prove their worth to the war effort. Based on Moholy's material studies lessons, Kepes developed a course in camouflage, which gained a great deal of attention. Not a project of his own creation, but following the principles Kepes set forth, which came directly from the Bauhaus material studies, Boeing's Seattle facility a prime target for bombing, was made to look from above like it was a residential neighborhood. So essentially a massive material studies, singular material study, in that the materials are deceiving us. We're not on the same scale as those eggshells and doilies, but they're sharing something with that. We, in our eyes as pilots flying over, conflate the ideas of rhythm and geometry and pattern to just assume that this is just a normal 1950s neighborhood or 1940s neighborhood. World War II left Germany in ruins. As Reconstruction began, an ambitious and undauntable young educator named Inga Scholl and her soon-to-be husband, Otto Eicher, had the idea to found a school. The memory of two of Scholl's siblings who had been members of the White Rose insurgents executed by the Gestapo during the war compelled her to found an institute of higher learning that would bolster a post-war democracy with a distinctly socialist inclination. Eicher was a renowned designer, so in their shared interest, they founded the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm, which translates as College for Design. With very little money circulating in the West German economy, they approached the US State Department, which became the school's majority stakeholder, thus ensuring that it was built upon an American ideology. Gropius, who had been at Harvard for 15 years by this point, was asked to be on the school's board of advisors. They chose as the school's first director a Swiss architect and Bauhaus graduate named Max Bill, seen here on the roof of the school that he also designed. During post-World War II Reconstruction, the Bauhaus was one of the few ideas from early 20th century Germany that West Germans wanted to celebrate. With Gropius and Bill in place, the Hochschule für Gestaltung, known as HFG, was set to be an opportunity for Bauhaus ideas to return to Germany. The school officially opened in 1953. Joseph Albers, by then the chair of the School of Art at Yale, came to Ulm that year as a visiting professor, as did Johannes Iden and Walter Petterens, another former Bauhaus master. Altogether, in HFG's preliminary course, which very closely resembled the curriculum developed 30 years earlier at the Bauhaus. All taught in HFG, which closely resembled the Bauhaus curriculum. Already in 1953, but even more so in 1955, when he returned to teach at Ulm a second time, Joseph Albers was demonstrably a successful artist. He would have been seen as something of a hero to many West Germans, having been to the Bauhaus, escaped Nazism, and returned with a thriving career. A few years earlier, he had begun his long series of paintings known as the Homage to the Square. He had big modern ideas that had their origins in his German background and were brought to fruition in an American context. In its relatively short existence, HFG expanded the holistic curriculum of the Bauhaus to include sociology, psychology, politics, economics, philosophy, and more. The Hochschule für Gestaltung Ulm closed in 1968 amid financial difficulties and the student protests of that year. However, its curriculum served as a model for design schools across the West and beyond. So I'm going to show a few more images of what the Alberses were up to. I'm leaning heavily on the Albers through all this because I work for the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation, so I'm super biased. But also they, I think, show us an awful lot about all these aspects that I'm trying to talk about. So Joseph Albers started making the Homage to the Square paintings in 1950. He continued making them until he died in 1976, making almost 3,000 of them across that time period. So I don't know how we're doing on time, but I thought I could show all 3,000. Cool. Just kidding. I've shown just a few just to sort of give an idea of the range of what he was up to. In these paintings, he really just wants us to see color. He'd been working through lots of different compositions and finally removed everything other than color and decided that the square was the least intrusive shape on color, and he needed some sort of container to hold the color. But really, he just wanted us to be able to compare, in this case, the red to the purple and the purple to the blue, and see how those colors sit next to each other, how they vibrate. One might be pushing, one might be pulling, they might be working together, they might be ganging up one on the other, they might be singing, they might be shouting, all these things that might be happening. Annie Albers continued to weave. When they got to Black Mountain College, she set up a weaving studio there and continued to weave across that period. When they got to Connecticut in 1950, when Joseph was made chair of the School of Art, she had had a solo show at MoMA in New York the year before. She was no longer teaching, and so she sort of had time and presumably extra confidence from the big MoMA show, and goes into this incredible 15, 17-year period of weaving, where she's making these beautiful objects like this. And then in the late 60s, she stops weaving. She had experimented with printmaking in that time period, and for any number of reasons decided that she was done weaving. In 1967, she starts working on this print, and so in 1969, she gets rid of her looms. She's 70 years old that year and moves into another chapter as an artist. And for my money, perhaps the most interesting period of her career is from 1969 until, let's say, early 80s, when she's suddenly experimenting with this new material or this new medium of print. In 1967, when invited to include their work in a print portfolio being organized by the art critic Dory Ashton that would be sold to support anti-Vietnam War causes, Annie wrote back saying simply that they preferred not to. That was certainly not to say that they were in favor of the war. In many other instances, the Alberses denounced violence. Instead, they meant that they held their art to be above and separate from everything else, including war. It was close to a religious conception of art. Several times in recent years, I've had the opportunity to speak to younger artists who are shocked to learn that the Albers didn't make overtly anti-war art during the Vietnam War era. With so much identity-based and political protest art being made and consumed today, their confoundment is understandable. But in the light of Cold War aesthetics, in which we can see the Albers' modernist approach to image making as formal and therefore Western, I would say that the very act of their continuing to make work in the ways that they desired sets an example for truly free thinking. And again, I'll close with this wonderful quote from Annie that speaks to a number of the things that I've sort of moved us through, but specifically sort of this, what it is that drove them to make art. Our world goes to pieces. We have to rebuild our world. We investigate and worry and analyze and forget that the new comes about through exuberance and not through defined deficiency. We have to find our strength rather than our weakness. Out of the chaos of collapse, we can save the lasting. We still have our right or wrong, the absolute of our inner voice. We still know beauty, freedom, happiness, unexplained and unquestioned. Thank you.
All right, everybody, and we have time to take a few questions, if interested. So just by show of hands, I'll bring a mic over.
Yes, I had a question. Was there any influences between the Stil movement and the Bauhaus movement?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question of the Stil movement, this was a Dutch movement that kind of just, or it overlaps more or less with the exact period of the founding of the Bauhaus. And let's see, who are the major players there? So Mondrian is in the room, and then Van Doesburg, Theo van Doesburg, who is one of those international constructivists who comes to Weimar in 22. So absolutely there is some overlap there. As far as I know, there was none of the Stil people ever actually taught at the Bauhaus or even lectured necessarily, but they were in Weimar and therefore associating with these people, and the ideas were circulating, certainly.
You showed just that one slide of the nested tables. Could you talk a little bit more about the kinds of things that they created at the time when the Bauhaus was trying to be more industrial and responding to Germany's sort of industrial needs, or are those objects sort of lost to history?
Well, certainly some of them would be lost to history, but a fair amount of the furniture that was designed around that time period was serving that purpose of trying to be a way of the Bauhaus making money and engaging with industry. The textile workshop, or the weaving workshop rather, it was apparently the most successfully financially because they were able to design fabrics, not necessarily the art-leaning things. I don't know if those were selling in such quantities that the school was supporting itself, but the things along the lines of that wall covering that Annie Albers designed for Meyer's project, those were simple designs that could be scaled up and made by industrial looms. And so the licensing of that was able to support the school. Wallpaper design was another one. There were some architecture projects. Ultimately, the school never, partly because of the history of what German politics was doing at the time, and the school was very left-leaning, was openly avant-garde, which was sort of the exact wrong words to say to a Nazi. They probably didn't have the opportunities that they would have had in a more progressive society. So ultimately, the school was not financially super successful.
So this slide staying up, I mean, the infusion of color is a surprise to me because I always equate Bauhaus with just cold, and, you know, the first form of the first building is what that you showed today, is what I always think of when I think of Bauhaus. So were the Albers the first people to infuse color into the movement of Bauhaus?
No, not at all. But the great question, because I think it sort of points to something that we might generally assume about the Bauhaus, that it is this very cold, rigid, there's no ornament, there's only white and black and maybe red. And that's not without reason. There is like some of the slides I showed certainly have that sort of aesthetic in it. But there was a lot of color, and I also intentionally sort of heavily loaded the early images where it's very sort of junky stuff being stuck together, and it's the word I'm looking for here. Provisional is not the word I was thinking, but that's a good one. Yes, it's lurking here. It's going to show up. It's a word we all know. In any case. Organic is another one, which also, keep going. Sorry. At any rate, these early ideas that are very expressive, that don't seem quite so Bauhausy. Joseph Albers didn't teach color at the Bauhaus. He would have included some color in his preliminary course, and obviously in this particular design, color is present, but of those masters of design, some of them included Paul Klee, Vasily Kandinsky, Itten. These are three incredibly colorful artists who all had their own theories. I'm putting quotes on theory because some of them didn't really espouse the idea of a theory about color, but ways of thinking about color. And so color was certainly there. And I think some of our historic conception of that is because all of the photographs are black and white, and only objects that actually survived can we look at the color. Albers then gets to Black Mountain College. Joseph Albers gets to Black Mountain College and immediately starts teaching color. And in fact, the book that Michael was very kindly holding up is based on a lot of the ideas that Joseph Albers first was teaching at Black Mountain College, then at Yale. And Albers probably didn't invent any of the ideas. He just sort of brought these things together. So they would have been things he had seen at the Bauhaus. So there was a lot of color going on there. Yeah.
I think we got time for two more questions. I'll take one down there and then one up there.
Can you just talk a little bit more about the relationship of the school to the Bauhaus school to the government early on? To what degree what it was doing might have been administered or in spite of what the government was requesting or thought they were funding, or how much that kind of dynamic was in play?
Sure. Of course, that's a super complicated question, so that's like a PhD too. So I'm going to quickly give my PhD here. I don't have a PhD. So let's see. The Bauhaus was formed in 1919, and that was a government initiative it was, as I said, widely observed that the Industrial Revolution was producing these low-quality things. And so some Germans were sent to observe what was going on with the arts and crafts movement, and then they came back, and there's sort of some movements across the decades prior to the Bauhaus's forming, which results in Gropius getting some funding to start this school in 1919. Some pressure comes in the early 20s for them to actually show what they've done, and that is in part because politics are moving right, and the school is what they were. They moved sufficiently right by 1925 that they were no longer able to be supported in Weimar. And there was a very progressive mayor in the town of Dessau, which is a little bit north of Weimar, but still in East Germany, or what would be East Germany. And so that mayor invites the Bauhaus and is able to use some state funding there to fund the building of that school, the building, that Gropius designed. But things continue to move further right, and so funding is continuing to be pulled, and by 1933, they're forced out of Dessau and end up in Berlin, and only for a very short period. That school was then taken over for a short period by Nazis and cleaned up, and the Nazis said, okay, we've cleaned up your school, you can open again. And the few who were still there in the school at that time period, the teachers got together and said, we can't do this in this context, so we're going to close of our own accord. Okay, so there's obviously many, many more details within all that, but that's kind of perhaps.
Thank you for that presentation. Can you talk more about furniture design and the Bauhaus movement, especially someone called Eileen Gray, if you're familiar with her work?
I am only glancingly familiar, and so I can't really say much more about how Gray...
She had a lot of color especially with the nesting tables that you just presented.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I will. That's research for me to do.
She was right around that time, 2022.
Okay, I'll check it out. Can we get one more?
Yeah, I think we get one more. Oh, that's right.
Sure, I was curious about, two-part question, but the tension between sort of craft exploration and industrialization during the Bauhaus, but also I think if I understood you correctly, it was curtailed by the sort of political environment they were in. Did any of that materialize in the sort of move to the U.S., either through Mies or the Albers, or did any of them sort of realize a more direct connection between industrialization and craft and design?
I think for many, that's a great question. And for many of them, it remained sort of the topic. Annie Albers specifically continued to work both as a weaver of functional fabrics, so upholsteries and curtains and things and rugs, and fine art objects. And her 1949 exhibition at MoMA exhibited these things side by side, which was a sort of a small revolution in the textile world, that these two things could exist in the same room by the same person and be sort of seen on the same level. And she continued to have architectural commissions for the rest of her, nearly the rest of her life. And then someone like Mies, who was so focused on sort of the academic side of architecture, he sort of remains in the most functional end of things. Joseph Albers probably goes the other direction, where his students had been doing things that were sort of becoming a little bit functional somewhat, and his furniture was becoming functional, certainly. At the Bauhaus, he gets to Black Mountain College, and things go much more poetic. And it's just because he was teaching a different student body who weren't necessarily interested in engaging in the more functional side. Some of them were, but for the most part, they were doing these more poetic ideas.
Hey, beautiful. Let's give an applause for Fritz. I appreciate the presentation.